After 4 years of an America-first approach that frustrated G7 counterparts, President Joe Biden trumpeted his country's return to a consensus-seeking approach and a recommitment to multilateralism.
I felt, and it wasn't about me, but it was about America, I felt a genuine sense of enthusiasm that America was back at the table and fully engaged.
The G7 communiqué in the main pledges to end the pandemic by scaling up vaccine production and distribution to the rest of the world, supporting a green revolution and committing to net zero carbon emissions by no later than 2050. Reinvigorating economies to shift from crisis response to promoting growth through infrastructure investments and a free and fair global trade environment. While seeking to blunt China's influence, the G7 promised to invest $80 billion into the private sector in Africa over the next 5 years to support sustainable economic growth.
I think we're in a contest, not with China per se, but a context with autocratic governments around the world, as whether or not democracies can compete with them in the rapidly changing 21st century. And I think how we act and whether we pull together as democracies is going to determine whether our grandkids look back 15 years from now and say, did they step up? Are democracies as relevant and as powerful as they have been?
After meeting with President Cyril Ramaphosa, the White House readout says they discussed their bilateral relationship, underscoring the need to expand global COVID-19 vaccine supply and cooperation on climate goals, among others.
In my discussions with President Biden, we did say to him that we would like the doses that he's going to donate also to be channeled to Africa, also to be channeled to South Africa. And he agreed that he's going to do precisely that as soon as possible. So we should be able to get some doses from that end, and we will be able to get doses also from Europe. And we will then be able to have, as we have often said, a multi-vaccine doses type of situation.
As the focus at the NATO and EU summits shifts to what officials call emerging threats of China and Russia, with firm language from the G7 calling for an end to Moscow's destabilizing behavior and for Beijing to respect human rights. The communiqué also condemned the ongoing atrocities in Ethiopia's Tigray region, where the United Nations warns famine conditions are already a reality, echoing calls for an immediate end to hostilities and unimpeded humanitarian access. As Biden now engages with strategic partners in NATO and Europe, as he seeks to build momentum ahead of his face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday in Geneva, with both leaders agreeing that relations between Washington and Moscow are at a low point. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
So let's continue the discussion now with our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. So Sherwin, it would appear that Africa received its fair share of the attention at the G7 summit. So talk us through it, through efforts to scale up vaccines, to new money to the tune of $80 billion for African companies in the next 5 years.
Yeah, so the big story really is the 1 billion doses, Tsepiso, that the G7 has pledged to the world, to poorer countries that have had difficulties in accessing vaccine doses as compared to some of the more developed nations around the world. Of course, the 1 billion only going so far. In terms of the World Health Organization estimates that we need 11 billion doses if we really are going to be serious about ending this coronavirus pandemic. But also tucked into this very detailed communique, as you mentioned, is the $80 billion. This is the first time that development finance institutions of the Group of 7 nations have made a collective commitment to the African continent seen very much Tsepiso as an effort to counter China's growing influence in places like Africa. And how this money will be spent, we understand, is it's going to be directed at companies that can boost economic growth in these African economies towards improving their abilities to reach the targets set out in the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is money for development through the private sector so that African countries can make better and faster progress towards the SDGs by 2030. The other big story, and let's also point out that President Cyril Ramaphosa was the only African leader invited to the G7 summit, so not certainly without a great deal of attention. And he has been plugging away at this conversation with international financial institutions and richer countries around special drawing rights. Essentially, special drawing rights are this international reserve asset that is held by the International Monetary Fund, and it provides liquidity to countries that are facing crisis, as many countries are, of course, facing today because of the pandemic. It's something President Ramaphosa addressed again at the G7 summit. This is how he framed it.
We know that there's $650 billion that has been talked of and has been more or less agreed, and we also want access to that so that your G7 countries and your more developed economies should donate the rights that they have and have them allocated to countries that do not have those rights. Now, there's talk of making $100 billion available. Initially, it was said to be $33 billion, and we've argued that it should be increased. We are still aiming for at least 25%, which could be in the range of $162 billion.
So he wants 25%, as do African economies, of the $650 billion. And to explain it very briefly, Tsepiso, the way countries can access these special drawing rights, it's based on the size of one's economy and the openness and transparency with which that economy operates. And of course, that is, a complicated equation for many economies. So the president of South Africa really pushing for greater equity in terms of accessing those funds, particularly for the African continent.
And there's the NATO summit that's taking place in Brussels ahead of the EU summit, and the US president also tomorrow to focus on issues of security and, of course, the much anticipated meeting between Presidents Biden and Putin. So it seems like a busy pit stop for him.
Busy, but with a very clear focus, right? China, 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 and Russia, 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 and how Western allies, particularly Western democracies that make up NATO in large part, and the EU certainly in its entirety, can better counter perhaps not the geopolitical issues as it pertains to geography and location, but the wars that are now being fought in cyberspace. As you'll be aware that there have been a number of ransomware attacks, most recently on critical infrastructure, including energy supply in the United States. So a huge conversation point at the NATO summit is about how to better shore up cyber defenses. I'll read you a little bit of the statement. Tsepiso, we face, this is the NATO communiqué, we face multifaceted threats, systemic competition from assertive and authoritarian powers, as well as growing security challenges to our countries and our citizens from all strategic directions. Russia's aggressive actions constitute a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. It continues further down in the paragraph. China's growing influence in international policies can present challenges that we need to address together as an alliance. It was something that both Joe Biden and Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, addressed. This is what they said.
There is a growing recognition over the last couple of years that we have new challenges. And we have Russia that is not acting in a way that is consistent with what we had hoped, and as well as China.
China is coming closer to us. We see them in cyberspace. We see China in Africa, in the Arctic, but we also see China investing heavily in our own critical infrastructure and trying to control it. We have seen the discussions about 5G, Huawei. And that's the reason why the NATO 2030 agenda is so important, because that agenda is about strengthening our resilience, it's about investing more in technology, and it is also about making sure that we step up when it comes to cyber defenses.
So President Biden, in many ways, really seeking to shore up support from NATO, tomorrow from the European Union. The White House officials are talking about him having the wind at his back as he engages with President Putin on Wednesday in Geneva, Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. So finally, Sherwin, let's talk about other issues with U.S. President's trip to Europe. There's a new government in Israel, which is obviously a close ally, a strategic ally of the United States, and there's already been a quick response from the White House. Congratulations to the Prime Minister and the alternate Prime Minister. A little bit more detail on these developments. So what are they saying?
He is traveling in Europe. Of course, the change of government after the historic 12 years at the helm for former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the White House, one of the first governments, of course, to respond to this change in government. And you'll understand that the United States, of course, Israel's closest ally and very important strategic partner in terms of its relations in the Middle East. The one thing that stands out from the White House statement, Sepiso, is that there is no mention of Benjamin Netanyahu, and I think that speaks to the frosty relationship that he enjoyed with the Obama administration. Of course, Vice President Biden at the time, very much part of the fray, and then certainly when he took office earlier this year, he says that Israel has no better friend than the United States. The bond that unites our people is evidence of our shared values and decades of close cooperation, and as we continue to strengthen our partnership, the United States remains unwavering in its support for Israel's security. So nothing different in terms of the strategic relationship between Washington and Israel, but certainly no thanks or pat on the back for Netanyahu on his way out the door.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, my correspondent out there in New York.